Good morning, good afternoon to you all. We are starting our webinar now entitled Do Look Up Policies for Climate and Heritage, which is part of a series with three other online seminars which are part of a larger project, Roots and Resilience. Today we have three professors here with us, Luana Campos. I'll introduce each one of them individually in a while. Professor Leonardo Castriota, and Professor Rowan Jackson. We also have representatives from the six communities who have been working within the project. Casa Quilombe from Brumadinho, Inhotim Institute, the Musical Corporation, Banda de São Sebastião, also from Brumadinho, Carlos Drummond de Andrade Foundation from Itabira, the Atrás do Pano group from Nova Lima, and the Isquindo Cultural Association from Mariana. I hope I haven't left anyone out. There are six cultural organizations or communities who are taking part in the project. What is Roots of Resilience, the project? It's a project conducted by People's Palace Project, which is an organization linked to Queen Mary University, London. People's Palace Project has been operating in Brazil for 24 years, as well as many other places, with projects that carry out this intersection between art, research, culture, associated to the quest for human rights evaluation and social justice in the context of justice in the complex context we have in Brazil, especially today. Roots of Resilience, this project is coordinated by Paul Heritage and Leandro Variado, and they are in the Minas Gerais iron ore region, the iron ore square as it's called, which is very notorious for its values, natural environment, cultural environment, but also well known for being a mining area, which became very notorious negatively in the last few years, unfortunately, because of the major environmental crimes who happened there in 2015 and 2019, more precisely in Mariana and Brumadinho, with the uh, tailings dam break, which cost many human lives and a high environmental cost. Within this context of climate change, which is the main focus of our debate here, climate change dramatically recorded climate change as per the latest intergovernmental panel on climate change, but also experienced and observed in our day-to-day lives with the very heavy rainfalls and other natural accidents, carrying risk to natural and cultural heritage, especially in a region which is very fragile and with many values where we work. The project tries to understand the way of researching and working and doing the interface between these cultural organizations with their environment and their territorial area in order to seek better life conditions and value culture and seek alternatives within a frankly monopolized area by a single economic process, mining. The questions here the webinar proposes to ask above all is to strengthen the capability for adaptation in response, well, strengthening resilience of these communities in the face of this context, which I've just mentioned, but also trying to see what culture and heritage, what roles they can play within this context. We will join all the questions together at the end, and we will start with Professor Luana Campos' presentation. She is an archaeologist, a master's degree, professional master's degree profession at the IFAM Institute, the National Institute of Historical and Artistic Heritage. IFAM, unfortunately, her career was interrupted recently. Let's hope she will go back. And she also works on the Climate Change Board. at ICOMOS. Good morning, Jurema. Thank you for your presentation. Good afternoon, or sorry, good morning to you all who are watching us. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation, for the opportunity, and the trust to afford the possibility of debating about this theme this morning. So now, presentations past, I'd like to ask the organizers to share my PowerPoint presentation, please. I will be here to talk about the specific theme of climate change and cultural heritage. In my brief presentation, I brought up this title because I thought it's very unique to this moment: Public Policies for Climate and Cultural Heritage. This project, Roots of Resilience, which is recently disseminated, it shows how important the theme of climate change is and this interface between culture, climate, and action. I think it summarizes well what we think in terms of climate change and what we think in terms of heritage and action, both for the Climate Change Committee, also Heritage Board, also the other issues we have worked on and about which we have had news. So please, can you run the, if you can run the presentation? So I'd like to start off today by drawing your attention to a very important issue. We're going to talk about very sensitive issues here. When we talk about disasters and tragedies, it's important to make very clear that what really matters above all is life. What we're going to do here, talking about climate change, a few disasters, and the memory of some tragic events which took place, we will be talking about heritage in a cutout, so to speak. When we talk about heritage, when we talk about losing heritage, we lose memories and lives past. This is also very important, but we will never not clarify and point out that life first, it's life first, and the main immediate actions must be in that respect for that. We also need to be concerned about cultural heritage, and it's a bit of what we're going to talk about now, amongst other things. I don't want to be too boring and rambling on, but I must bring in my teacher's vocation or calling. I'm going to talk about a few key concepts. These concepts will help us to design, project a scenario, both which the committee has been working on, as well as the scenario we see in Brazil today. The first concept I bring up is the concept of heritage. Heritage must be understood not as something static referring to a distant past, but as something dynamic. The concept of heritage, if we only separate Brazil for a second, leaving out the history, for example, history from France and French Revolution, focusing on Brazil, we have a theme here cut out. It's a concept that has developed throughout the years and has changed throughout the years. We have had different ways to look at and understand Brazilian heritage. So this first notion is very important for us to think about, to think forward about resilience and adaptation when we talk about heritage. So according to Smith, we have heritage heritage can be understood as a cultural practice involved in the construction and regulation of a set of values and understandings incorporated by many layers of societies, both so much the visitors who look at a cultural asset open to presentation, the detainers, researchers, managers, media, different levels of society who look at. I think today we're going to focus a bit on, or at least I will bring along a bit of this in my presentation. We're going to talk about looking at. We're trying to understand what's happening. We notice what's happening, but we're not able to sometimes look at it. Both. So all these I've just mentioned look at an asset and assimilate an authorized and a discourse with authority devised by in terms of management, and that also talks about the past and its reconstruction. Another concept, which is very extremely important, which at a certain point in time does not seem to have a direct relation to the concept I've just showed, and it's climate. According to the World Meteorological Organization, a climate can be defined as an average weather condition in a certain area for at least 30 years. We have a certain difficulty to understand climate. Not people directly involved in research, of course, they will have more, shall we say, maturity to understand the difference between climate and weather. But speaking in our everyman context, let's say, it's difficult to separate some of these notions. That's why it's important to single out these concepts and highlight some of them. Another concept which is very important is to think that climate comprises a whole system. When we talk about climate, we're talking about systems. We're talking about different elements, about different limits, both internal and external, which will relate systemically, or in other words, interdependently from each other, in order to form a whole, so to speak, a set of conditions which will conform itself as a weather. One back, please. No, you've gone past all of them now. Right, that's the one. Okay, right. And the focus here is to think beyond this concept of climate. What do we understand as climate change, or the change in this systemic regime that interacts with other elements and that transforms itself over time? So the definition, I've taken this from a book launched by ICOMOS. I'll talk about it later. Climate changes refer to a change in the state of the climate, which can be identified through a few methodologies, for example, statistical tests, and a change in the variability or average of its features over a period of time. At least that is what you consider over 30 years. During decades or longer, when you understand consolidated climate. Climate change can be due to internal processes, natural ones, which we know as climate cycles, climate events, or external factors such as solar explosions, alterations in many alterations. There are many definitions. Working with the climate sometimes is a bit strange to us. As a modulation of solar eruptions, volcanic eruptions, and changes and consistent changes in terms of the composition of the atmosphere and land use. We can consider that man enters in the relation of this climate system as a forcing element, an element that modifies this atmospheric condition and that modifies the system. It is observed that Convention 4 on climate change in their first article defines climate changes as climate change which is directly or indirectly attributed to human activity, which alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and in additionally to climate variability, natural climate variability observed throughout comparable periods of time. So we notice that in this definition, there is definition focused on man. Man who will somehow alter these elements, and because we are talking about a system, any alteration to the element generates a reaction. So it's an action that generates a reaction. I found the reference very interesting regarding the theme of today's presentation. It's a reference to the film, right? Don't Look Up, which was nominated for an Oscar, which shows the importance and the quality of the theme. But I think it's not enough when we talk about climate change to only not look up or to look up. We need to look everywhere, to look to all sides. As I said before, climate, when we talk about climate, we're talking about something systemic. We're talking about elements or relationships that are interconnected to the most to many different connections, various connections. So when we look regardless of the direction, what do we see? Here I show you some elements or facts which appeared in the media recently and not so recently, what we could call extreme events, which are a consequence of these climate alterations. Many of these changes are observed through these extreme events, whether heavy rainfalls or extreme drought, all consequences that involve this relationship. So here we have Goiás town in the state of Goiás, Old Goiás, as the quarters are known. And in the definition, when we talked about the period of time, what we observe is, I always think about Al Gore's film 20 years ago, right, An Inconvenient Truth, which mentioned the importance of this in a media sense of climate changes. And it says that we as society, with regard to climate changes, are like frogs in cold water. For those who didn't watch the documentary, Al Gore relates a frog when you put it in cold water and slowly heat it, the frog remains in the water, does not perceive this gradual temperature change. And in our case, the piecemeal regime change. And when we compare and when we look at and see what's happening, we start to see that these issues are interconnected. We are talking about something systemic. So Goiás, Cora another town in the state of in the interlands of Brazil, we have had a few flood events throughout the years which caused major impact in that region. The historical center protected due to its architectural and historical heritage. Ligia, from documentation, did a great job saving some of the assets that were ruined by not this flood, but these floods. If I show you these photos without adding a date, you think it's the same period with different perspectives of the same place. What we notice here is 2001, 2011, and 2010. So we're not talking about an event in isolation. We're talking about a recurring cyclical fact or event. So São Luís Parintinga, another town. If I don't put the dates there, they're going to say, no, no, Luana, that's the same picture. No, they are different points in time where torrential rains were went beyond expectations. It's interesting when we think of expectations. What are the expectations? If we already know and are aware that we are going through a climate change process. So, what are the expectations? That of the models, or what is normal during a period of time? I believe that humankind has matured enough in order to understand that these time periods are spaces between one alteration or one change or a point of a cycle, the edge of a cycle, the tip of a cycle, and another. So we have 2010, 2022. Here we see the tragedy that shocked us all. I define it as a tragedy because of the relationship with the natural issues, but it was possible. All these cycles, everything I'm going to show here, was 20, 30 years ago since the first occasion. So I have 1988, 2011, 2022 in Petropolis, or the mountain region of Rio de Janeiro state. Not the top one, I think, but the two bottom ones are in the mountain region, Petropolis. The impacts of these torrential rains, especially in this Serrana, or the mountainous area of Rio de Janeiro state. This has already alerted researchers. I'd like to mention here Dr. Ana Brandão and Dr. Antonio Oscar Jr., who were able to identify climate cycles associated to the warming of the Atlantic waters and the area of the Atlantic forest. Next, please. Some of the events that I'm showing here, we notice a certain cyclical element in them. Some may ask, and the most skeptical may say, that's natural. There's no way we can create ways to mitigate these actions. That is not necessarily the case, as we will see. Right. Now, here we have 2016, a few more recent recurrences. 2016, a tornado which hit the museum and affected many pieces in the museum in São Miguel. The impact of this tornado was so violent that glass shards were embedded in some of the pieces, and also in the city of Goiás, Cidade de Goiás. We look at these pictures and again we think it's the same picture from the same year, the same place, I should say, taken in the same year with slightly different perspectives. But no, we can see that there is some alteration. Let's think that our chronological time order is not necessarily a measurement of time where we observe these environmental alterations. These environmental alterations will happen regardless of our perception of them. And it's clear, for example, a bit closer now to what happened in Ouro Preto, we see here what happened in 2021. Notice 20th of October 2021 and 13th of January 2022. You have a flood situation, right, in the Ouro Preto region, torrential rains, and you have the impact here. You have a landslide impacting these protected houses and some ordinary houses. And people say, Luana, you're talking about tragedies and events that cyclically affected the heritage assets. When we talk about climate system, we're talking about a system which has intensified by means of extreme events as man has established himself as an environment forcer, if you will. In the face of all these images I've shown, we see that the impacts happened impacting cultural assets, protected heritage, and assets recognized, acknowledged as part of the Brazilian identity and heritage. So, When we stop a while to understand all these relationships, we must be, as I would say, um, according to the popular um, saying, one eye on the cat and one on the fish. So we have to know where these assets are. There are many, many projects that have been developed seeking to identify how vulnerable these assets are. And the other look, casting our eye over climate changes, in this case, the IPCC, unfortunately, did not have the repercussion that I expected it would have in the media. The report was launched, few people paid due attention to it, which is a report that says that we are close to the tipping point. But in some aspects, I think we can say that this tipping point is past us. We no longer have a point of return. For example, when we talk about the cryosphere or our poles, our glaciers, the report was launched last year, and this year an average warming was recorded of 4.8 degrees Celsius, more, more at the poles. Media didn't give really a damn about this. We're talking about issues that impact the Earth's poles, research and everything. But how do we look at this research from elsewhere? When we look at them on a global scale, I'm going to bring this back. We're talking about systemic elements. We're talking about systemic climate. This is a system which, when impacted at the poles, will impact the rainfall scenario. So we have the evidence of rains that are stronger and stronger. What we see, and we don't really have to go too far in terms of complete scientific methodologies. All you have to do is a cutout here in terms of the media and reports. What you will most hear is heaviest rainfall in the last 50, 100 years, the last rainfall ever, the largest drought ever. I just pulled out rainfall here because I might be a bit over my time.
And then comes the big question that everybody makes when we start talking about climate change. What can we do? Then I come back to the reference of the title of the event to the movie. If you haven't seen the movie, it's worth watching. The title is Don't Look Up. One of the first steps, and here's the recommendation of the steps based on the research developed in the postdoctorate research and the research group by the Ecology Institute of the University of Campinas is to stop denying. That's the first moment. We cannot keep that old narrative. The old narratives that says that my actions don't make an impact. Our actions don't make an impact. We'll solve that later. Unfortunately, mankind has been postponing it. And as we see the environment, as we see the huge destructions along history, we see that we cannot postpone it anymore. The second thing, or the second recommendation, if you will, is to understand the risks. We're talking about Brazil, which is a huge country with continental size. We have so much cultural heritage, material heritage, natural resources, genetic heritage, landscape, all types of heritage possible in our territory. And we have a climate diversity, which is also very diversified. And we need to understand of what climate we're talking about, what regions we're talking about. Then come a series of research, a lot of research that is not beyond the scope of that. Understanding what is happening and being integrated to the agencies. Not it's not about working for them, but sending information to them. If there is a monitoring project that you find interesting, so you help support it, and you can submit added work. In our institute, we are collaborating with that research, and many research centers are working around that. And so collaborating is very important. So we'll draw the attention to the things that are happening in those regions. We need to understand the risks. We need to understand this diversity. I focused on the Midwest and the Southeast. These are the regions I've been working more closely with. We see the climate impact in these regions, but also in the Northeast, we know about the drought. But is it only about drought? What is the research being done there? We need to be integrated as a continent, as Brazil is the size of a continent. And the third step is to act, to incorporate networks. We've been working in networks, uh, in committees for uh, climate change, and we need to add forces. Monitoring, as I said, we see outstanding work in that area, contact with civil defense, with other mechanisms in your city that help us monitor, especially in this case, cultural heritage. If you see that there are things that are decaying, that are not working as they should, you should report that. You should help spread the word. We saw in Capitolio, the city where there was a disaster, there was a natural disaster with tourists. We saw what was happening, but we didn't see much, we didn't do much. We are stuck in our catharsis. We need to protect our heritage. We cannot wait for institutions to do the whole work. This is part of our identity, and this is part of taking ownership of that heritage. So being aware of that makes a huge difference. About working in networks, I'd like to invite everyone watching this and everyone interested to be part of the committee uh, about climate change and heritage. We have actions on the 18th, that is next Monday. We'll have an event to celebrate 50 years of World Heritage of the law with important participations. We're also part of the Climate Heritage Network to incorporate more of this network. Here's the link. If you are interested, I'll ask the organizers of this event to uh, put that in the chat box. You can fill this form and take part in it. It is very important that we join forces. And finally, I'll try to answer a question that was made recently. How can cultural heritage be mobilized in risk management? We have the elements to mitigate risks. So how can the cultural heritage be included? We have three words that are key for that: mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. In terms of mitigation, we can think that some projects have been developed about that. I'm not bringing hypotheses. This has been developed already. Uh, Actions for the immaterial heritage. We have the Xingu Association that has been working with reforestation. These projects are already in the carbon credit market. These are initiatives of these peoples, of these groups, indigenous groups, traditional groups, that help us review what we've been doing with the country for a long time. And also my my own cup of tea, the which is archaeology. This is the Serra da Capivara. I researched this area in my PhD, and they've been preserving the Caatinga. This is one of the single biomes of Brazil. We have the park of the Serra da Capivara that has been recovering huge areas and also bringing back animals, the fauna that was disappearing from that region, and also generating income to these people and other sustainability actions. In terms of adaptation, we can think of two biases. Um, Reviewing some criticism that we've been receiving in terms of our work with cultural heritage, reviewing the concept of originality. These are concepts that have an effect when we restore materials that are not sustainable. We want to bring these elements or this element of originality as an element to foster the debate. This is something very important. And also the external adaptation, like historic transformations of changes a long time. When we think of adaptive process, we think of how human groups have adapted a long time to conditions imposed to them. Considering that these changes are part of history, so we are able to see what has been done. And in terms of resilience, when we think of heritage and resilience, heritage is an element to foster resilience, the resilience that humankind has practiced a long history of slave made people that were brought to the Cais do Valongo in Rio, for example, resilience of the groups as we see in the picture above of the Serra da Barriga, where human groups survived adverse conditions, joining forces, black people, indigenous people, shaping a community that has been destroyed but still exists in the memory of that heritage. And obviously, the waterfall of Iaraute, the Iaraute waterfall, that brings the memory of indigenous peoples that suffered and were devastated with the occupation process of Brazilian territory. They are part of a memory that has been authorized, that has been selected, and that allows us to review our own history and understand how humankind became resilient along that period of time. Thank you very much, and I apologize for exceeding the time. Thank you very much, Luana. No, you are just in time, and now we have the presentation by Professor Rowan Jackson from the University of Edinburgh. He's a geographer and a professor, researcher, director of the sustainability program of the university with the topics of heritage, resilience, and climate adaptation. I'm pretty sure we'll have a great presentation. We'll have the chance to get to know more about your work. You have the floor, Professor.
Oh, thank you very much for the very kind invitation and for the kind introduction as well. I must say also that I thought the previous talk was fantastic, and I really liked the way it interwove the talk sort of wove the authorized cultural heritage theory throughout, and I think that's that's something that I also want to reflect on briefly within this presentation as well. So thanks so much for the invitation to talk today, and thank you to all of the other speakers as well in advance and after the last talk as well. So yeah, if we could move on to the slides now, that would be great. Thanks very much. So I'm going to present on behalf of a series of researchers, and it should be noted that this is a collaborative exercise between multiple different individuals. On the slide I have my colleague Kate Crowley, who's running the project, and I'm the postdoctoral research associate on the project, so helping out with coordination between partners. So we titled the presentation "The Role of Heritage Within Climate Change Risk Assessment and Adaptation." This is within 3 countries, so we're looking at 3 specific case studies, and they are Sri Lanka, Indonesia and South Africa. And we owe all of the research in this project really to the collaboration between and within those countries, especially under quite challenging circumstances with COVID-19. And I'll introduce each of the project partners in turn. But we really wanted to look at first, possibly naively, at how we could produce international risk assessment tools and how we could look at cultural heritage as something that delivers capacities. And to start with, we were thinking very much around conventional risk and adaptation frameworks that you might see within mainstream adaptation and resilience literatures and risk assessment tools that you might find within the classic disaster risk reduction literatures, all of which you'll see reviewed extensively throughout the IPCC reports. Now, this is not to say that we're going to challenge anything in particular about the IPCC reports, but we're attempting to challenge some of the dominant narratives and some of the narratives that we might actually include under this idea of authorized heritage and authorized frameworks that are often dominant or used disproportionately within cultural heritage. So that's what we're going to talk about. So if we go on to the next slide. There we go. So I'm going to run through setting the scene, so what we were aiming to do in the critical project. I'm going to say what the key aims are of the critical project and how they came about. I'll then move on to the research design and the implementation of our research project, and then go through in a bit more detail and hopefully in their own words, if we can review the videos, each of the sites that we've focused on. I'll then review some of the key messages and then talk about some of the next steps that involve not just our own project, but the wider range of projects that have been funded under the banner of the Arts and Humanities Research Council and Department for Culture, Media and Sport portfolio on cultural heritage and climate change, and that includes this wider project, Roots and Resilience. Next slide, please. But just to set the scene, and I think the previous presentation did a fantastic job of setting the scene around climate change. I wanted to start with this report from the International Council on Monuments and Sites in 2019. I'd encourage everyone to read this report because it deals with some quite complex concepts and updates a lot of very conventional cultural heritage frameworks and concepts. It's the feature of our past reports, and in the report they talk about the idea of heritage must be understood and acted upon in its broadest sense. Now, cultural heritage, of course, when we think about it, we might first think about those material aspects of cultural heritage. We might think about, I'm talking from Edinburgh, we might think about the castle straight away. We might think about the city and the architecture. But of course, we often fail to think about that which makes these monuments so important, which is the people and what they invest in those sites and the values and the value frameworks that are developed from those sites. And because of this, we wanted to focus on disaster risk reduction. So we wanted to look at how does cultural heritage support people's capacity to adapt to climate change, but also to things like volcanic eruptions in the case of Indonesia and Yogyakarta, which is one of the case studies I'll talk about in more detail later, but also things like floods and earthquakes and tsunamis. We also, of course, wanted to focus on mitigation strategies. How does heritage offer sustainable practices, examples of sustainable practice that are long-lived? And then also adaptation. So how are identities and how is culture interwoven with how we'll address the challenges in the future associated with climate risk? And how do these have an impact on our behaviour? Or how does our behaviour in turn have an impact on how we perceive risk? So, as many of you, of course, will already know, and you'll have gathered from the previous presentation, culture shapes our identity, and it delivers with this capacities and exposes us to vulnerabilities. Yet cultural value, capacity, and vulnerability are often missing from risk assessments. In fact, if I use an example, one of the definitions that you'll find within the IPCC reports of risk, it's right in front of you in the definition. The definition says the potential for consequences where something of value is at stake and where the outcome is uncertain, recognizing the diversity of values. But what we often find within, at least within European, predominantly Western European and North American risk assessment frameworks, is a lack of emphasis on values and a lack of emphasis on changing values. Values are either missing from these literatures, if you look at the academic literature on the subject, or it's missing from the sort of collaborative dimensions, the way in which we engage with stakeholders. So when you read big reports from, for example, ICOMOS and UNESCO about World Heritage Sites, you'll see statements of outstanding universal value, but it's often predefined. It's often something that is synthesized and simplified and doesn't take into account local values. So we wanted to focus on that in these case studies. So the critical project looked at these different dimensions, these 4 specific dimensions. So it looked at cultural heritage risk and impact tools for integrated and collaborative learning. So we wanted to look at how can we develop a critical take on cultural heritage and develop an e-learning package and develop means through which we could collectively learn and dissect materials on cultural heritage risk. So for this, we've been developing an e-learning package that will be freely available from the university's web platform. So the University of Edinburgh's web platform, but freely available for everyone to use. And also, we've been using story maps, where we can disseminate the findings of the research through an interactive interface. And I'll say more about that later. We've also been questioning the approach to climate risk and heritage and looking at the degree to which local communities are represented in conventional risk frameworks and whether local forms of cultural heritage are often disproportionately avoided because they might be close to a World Heritage Site or because they're not as visible as World Heritage Sites. So they're often missing from cultural heritage risk assessments. We wanted to capture a diversity of voices, and this is not just within the local communities, but between cultural heritage experts in each of the countries that we've been working in. So cultural heritage experts in Sri Lanka, cultural heritage experts in Indonesia and in South Africa. And then trying to bring together these diversity of voices and to disseminate different ideas of cultural heritage more widely. Next slide, please. So this is the team. So it's made up of teams made up of a number of different collaborators, and the primary collaborators, the primary contacts for each location are within this slide. So leading the project has been Kate Crowley here at the University of Edinburgh. In South Africa, we have Sheena O'Connell and Dominique Nymond. who are both experts on food heritage and focusing on the community of Ilenskloof. We have Ari Retnawati and Esti Anatsari, who are both based in Yogyakarta in Indonesia and have been focusing on disaster risk in the context of the entire landscape around Mount Merapi, but particularly focusing on the Churi River that runs through Yogyakarta from the slopes of Mount Merapi volcano. And then taking a regional perspective, we have Dulma Karunaratne, who has been focusing on climate change adaptation through the role of women in village tank culture. So basically village tanks, these semi-natural features in many villages, and how they manage water and also manage the impacts of climate change on water resources and how they're managed over time. Next slides, please. So these are the research questions that we've been focusing on, and they've changed slightly throughout the project. So first, how can cultural value, vulnerability and significance be effectively understood and translated for use in risk assessments for cultural heritage management and resilience building? So quite a broad question there, and I'll get onto that and try and unpack that question later. What is required for the co-development of vulnerability models for cultural heritage? This has been one where we've very much challenged this question of vulnerability, of cultural heritage as something passive and at risk, as opposed to something that's more active and multi-dimensional, as captured within the ICOMOS 2019 report, with the multiple different dimensions of cultural heritage and what that means to people and what those objects, the tangibility and the intangibility of heritage, what that is. And then finally, how can we share learning across low and middle income countries for the development of a common cultural heritage risk framework? So we've been working on how to bring together different ideas of cultural heritage and different ideas of what's at risk, what capacities cultural heritage offers, and then trying to disseminate that more widely, not just to academic audiences, but to policymakers and to interest groups as well, to those who want to learn either in formal education settings. Next slide, please. So this is a bit of a complex slide. This is from the our initial plan about how we wanted to design the project. And this just gives an idea of the way in which we wanted to go through from synthesizing general approaches to cultural heritage within the academic literature, and then move downwards as we progressed through the project into collecting information, sharing that information, and delivering that information into the policy stream that we were feeding back into. So in the UK government and within the research councils within the UK. But I think we should skip over this one probably because it's a bit of a complex and probably a bit of a labyrinthine diagram there. Next slide, please. So these are multiple components of the project that I sort of alluded to a bit earlier on. So to start with, Kate and I are in Edinburgh. We're not actually in any of the countries that we've been working with, and this offered an opportunity. It offered an opportunity for our collaborators to work independently and really set their own targets for their research in South Africa, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia. And it also meant that we were able to take that broader perspective on the sort of general focus of heritage literatures, particularly in Western Europe and North America, and perhaps how these often disproportionately set the discourse on cultural heritage. So Kate and I were focusing on the wider literature, and we were focusing particularly on developing large-scale systematic reviews to understand how cultural heritage is approached, and cultural heritage risk assessments and value frameworks are approached within academic literatures. We then went on to do climate profile analysis. So for each location, for each region specifically, we collected information on how climate has changed over the last 100 years and how it will change over the next 50 years. So we developed climate profile work in each of those locations to define risks. We then collected site-specific narratives, and this was very much around each of our case partners developing narratives as opposed to something that simply defines risks to cultural heritage. So that's about how we represent cultural heritage and how we give voice to the communities who value cultural heritage specifically. From this, we then started to develop synthesized risk frameworks where we bring together independent ideas about how cultural heritage should be defined, how vulnerabilities should be defined, and what adaptive capacities are offered through cultural heritage in each site. And I'll go into those in a bit more detail later. And then finally, moving on to this second strand at the bottom left-hand corner of learning and sharing. So we collaborated with events at the recent Glasgow COP event, so COP26, that happened in November 2021. And we collaborated with a range of other collaborators from the wider portfolio of AHRC, so the Arts and Humanities Research Council funding stream on cultural heritage. And also presented information at side events associated with cultural heritage and climate change. We developed these story maps, and these are the outputs on the right-hand side. So these are these online ArcGIS interfaces where you can have maps and you can develop narratives around an entire landscape, and you can input multimedia content. So what you'll see on the right-hand side is some of the photos from Dulma, our Sri Lankan collaborator, who has collected local narratives on food culture within villages and the long-term narratives on climate change throughout people's lives and the forms of traditional knowledge that they've gathered and disseminated between generations over hundreds of years. So that's described through the food heritage theme here on the right-hand side in this narrative. And then at the top, you'll see the edge of Mount Merapi. It's not very clear, but you'll see the edge of Mount Merapi volcano and the Chodi River running down through Yogyakarta. And this provides a narrative on traditional understandings of disaster risk in the context of Mount Merapi, but also flood risk associated with volcanic eruptions and changing climatic conditions. So Story Maps offers a way not just of writing up academic articles and saying, this is what academics have found. It's also about sharing narratives and being able to disseminate narratives more widely and also embed them within e-learning packages that are openly accessible for higher education, but also for those who are interested in their own cultural heritage or cultural heritage elsewhere. And then finally, of course, all of this needs to be gathered together and it needs to influence policymakers. So in this project, we've also been working to try and synthesize not just the research from across each of our case partner locations, but also synthesize it together with broader research under the same research council and try and influence how policymakers perceive cultural heritage. It should be noted that the funding call for this project itself actually focused very much on developing quantitative risk frameworks and developing normative models about how you should address risk and vulnerability to cultural heritage. And there was very much an emphasis that seemed to indicate that material cultural heritage was what the focus should be. And from one initial synthesis exercise that we ran together with Praxis at the University of Leeds across all of the full portfolio of projects, is that more work is needed on knowledge dissemination across these different regions, the different regions involved in this funding call, and to share a diversity of voices, to share different understandings of cultural heritage and how cultural heritage should be approached from the outset. It's not just something where we should assume we all understand what is at risk and then develop quantitative frameworks. It's also about giving voice to people and also about listening. Next slide, please. So to start with, we did the contextual reviews, these systematic reviews. So I'd been working on cultural heritage value, and Kate, my colleague, was working on cultural heritage risk assessment. So Kate's an expert on climate risk and disaster risk reduction, and I have a background in archaeology, so I focused on cultural heritage value. And what we found from both of these reviews was that the literature is still dominated by a preservation discourse, so a discourse around keeping things intact as they are perceived to have always been, sort of protecting castles, if it's Scotland, exactly the way you expect them to be, and not allowing them to change. A disproportionate focus on the built environment and architecture. They dominate the literature, and the literature is particularly dominated by how to conserve and how to focus on material science, how to preserve things intact as they are. There's a strong focus on exposure, how exposed are cultural heritage sites and landscapes specifically to the impacts of climate change. And there's a strong focus on World Heritage Sites and outstanding universal value to test frameworks on risk and adaptive capacity, but less focus on local communities and the role of local communities in cultural heritage conservation, so ongoing practices of understanding risk and value. There's no uniform definition of risk, and many of the articles, in fact, never actually define risk clearly. And value is often ill-defined or even missing from many of these frameworks. So understanding what is a value and how it's valued is a big question. And as discussed in the previous presentation, of course, value is often defined according to experts and what is perceived to be authorized as a given cultural heritage discourse. So, what is deserving of our protection, of preservation. And then, of course, there is a lack of local participation and a general absence of voice from the global south across the sort of dominant narratives that we see within the cultural heritage literature. Next slide, please. So there were therefore two core areas of concern that we wanted to focus on in this project in specific. The first was to question these sort of Western dominated discourses on heritage and risk assessment, and then also how to go about encouraging a diversity of voice, how do we consider value, and to take a broader view of heritage, how do we incorporate adaptive capacity, how can heritage be used in a practical sense within each of these different locations. Next slide, please. So across the three locations, we have three different scales of analysis. We have very different cultures, though some cultural similarities. And then, of course, three very different geographical contexts facing different exposures over the next 100 years or so, if you look at IPCC projections. So to start with, at the broadest scale, we have Sri Lanka. We have a focus predominantly in the south and east of Sri Lanka on communities, not just from a local perspective, but also from a more broad perspective on the role predominantly of women in village cultures, and particularly a focus on water and food practices. If we then move down to the city scale, we have Yogyakarta and the suburbs of Yogyakarta that run onto the south flank of Mount Merapi volcano in Indonesia. And the focus there was primarily on traditional knowledges, perception of risk, and the changing movement around rural and urban spaces along the Chodi River, which is often at risk of flooding, and there are risk of land subsidence and people being washed away if they choose to locate their housing on the edges of the river. And then finally, a very local scale focus. We see this in the picture on the right-hand side of the village of Ilenskloof, which is a village where the community were reallocated their land after forced removal in the 1960s under apartheid, when the Dutch Reformed Church in the Cederberg region of South Africa displaced this community. Back in the late 1990s, the community were re-awarded their land in a case that was seen as being very successful in terms of land restitution. However, this is a community who are still highly deprived as a result, not just of having all of their possessions taken from them in the 1960s, but also now of climate change as a result of climate change and the ongoing impacts that we're seeing in South Africa around water shortage. Next slide, please. So this is an example. I just wanted to focus because we don't have too much time for these presentations, just on how we're going about trying to disseminate work from each of these locations. So this is the Kali Chodi River. This is a story map that we developed along with SD and Ari, our Indonesian collaborators. And we wanted to think around heritage for climate change adaptation and disaster management in Yogyakarta city. So this is almost ready. We're just putting a few final little touches together in this story map that tries to highlight what is the cultural heritage of Yogyakarta, so very much around the cityscape and the entire cityscape being actually something that is now under consideration for World Heritage status, as well as the natural heritage to the north with the Mount Merapi volcano, the geocultural heritage of that, and the traditions associated with the volcano and agriculture on the southern flank. Next slide, please. I'm not sure whether this will run because this is a video about Yogyakarta. Would it be possible to play this video? Okay, so this is the video. It's quite quiet here. So this video has a little bit of sound distortion in the background, but in essence, what's being shown within the video are disaster experts along the Kali Chodi River, and they're travelling down and talking about some of the risks associated with settlement on the edge of the Chodi River and the risk of flooding from either caused by volcanic eruptions such as lahars, where a large body of water is forced down the river from the volcano, or where you've had extreme rainfall events which can lead to people being washed away in certain circumstances. But they're also talking about the cultural significance of the river and the importance to local communities. So there's this balance that needs to be struck around how the river's used, how the river's accessed, but also how people are sort of kept away from dangerous parts of the river. So we'll move on to the next slide now because it's probably a bit difficult to hear that.
In South Africa, the scars of inequality and social engineering that characterize the apartheid system persist despite nearly 3 decades of democracy.
Cool.
The country is one.
This is a video that we probably will be able to hear a little bit better, but this is just an outline by our South African partners of the Elandskloof village. So if it's possible to restart the video, this will set the scene about the importance of Elandskloof and the community. So I'll let this run from here.
The scars of inequality and social engineering that characterize the apartheid system persist despite nearly 3 decades of democracy. The country is one of the most unequal in the world and, combined with the current systemic deficiencies, limit largely forgotten communities' access to water and housing, climatic changes that produce periods of severe drought, and increase the number of people who find themselves destitute and vulnerable to illnesses. Elandskloof is nestled in the Cederberg, a natural heritage site. Yet for the inhabitants of this tiny village, day-to-day living means dealing with limited access to water and electricity, secure housing, and unforeseen weather challenges, including drought and floods.
Die inligting is dat, en ek dink dit is amper 99,9% akkuraat, dat omtrent 76 huisgesinne was uitgesit in 1962. En hierdie 76 huisgesinne, hulle het hulle sommige hulle gaan huisves die omliggende plase.
The history of Elandskloof tells a struggle of labour and land and exists as a legacy of the missions of the Church in South Africa. It is a site that speaks to the earliest Dutch occupation in the Cape. In post-apartheid South Africa, it is significant as it was the first successful land restitution case following the democratic moment in 1994. However, 25 years after residents returned to Elandskloof, the community is impoverished with little to no infrastructure. Traditional methods of farming that usually would have been handed down through the generations have been lost in the period that community was away from their land.
Soos hy vir my vertel het, dit in 'n dag se tyd gebeur wat hulle moes vir hulle self verwyder van Elandskloof af. En hulle is alendal toe tussen die bossietjies, so hulle het fisies onder die bossies geslaap voor hulle strukture kon opgerig het. En hulle moet eers plek vra by die eienaar van daai grond. Hulle was baie gelukkig. Ek ken eintlik alson daar. Ek was 12 jaar oud. Ons het op 'n lorry gekom, al die meubels op 'n lorry gesit. Ek was van die eerste kinders wat Elandskloof toe kon gekom het. Dit was baie lieflik, mooi bome. Daar was 'n pytjieboom wat ons almal van geëet het en hierdie billetjies, die vye. Dit was mooi by die pastorie, vrugtebome. Ons het baie lekker gespeel op Elandskloof. Ons kom. Hulle het verwag hulle gaan huise kry. Hulle het verwag dat ons 'n beter lewe gaan hê as voorheen van ons. Gelukkig het die krag gekom, maar andersins as dit het ons niks anders gesien nie. Van soos heidelik is ons meer agter as wat ons was toe ons op Elandskloof gekom het.
Ons was bly want ons het mos nou in Singokka gebly gedink as ons nou terugkom is dit 'n geboude huis, is elektrisiteit. Die lewe sal baie gemakliker wees as daar sal jy so sukkel met lobou daar jy moet water dra. Gedink dit se lopende water wees as jy water in die huis. Maar
South Africa is especially vulnerable to climate change due to both its geographical location in the dry subtropics and socio-economic landscape. The annual average temperature across South Africa in 2019 was around 1.1 degrees Celsius, warmer than the average for the period 1981 to 2010. Since 1951, there has been 0.16 degrees Celsius of warming per decade, inferring temperature increase within South Africa is higher than the average global trend. In South Africa, the number of droughts have increased by 220% between 1961 and 2016 as a result of anthropogenic forcing. This culminated most recently in the severe drought that hit Cape Town between 2015 and 2018. Forgotten communities require context-specific approaches to support them, taking into account histories, livelihood portfolios, and likely climatic change impacts.
'n Groot deel van die oorspronklike 76 het al uitgesterf, so hulle kinders lewe nog.
The context of food heritage finds itself entangled within the narrative of Elandskloof. The consumption of food within the study echoes the values of community, identity, and belonging. What is central to the understanding within this context is the vehement impact of Dutch and British colonization on indigenous foodways. Before the violent removal of its residents as a result of apartheid policy, Elandskloof once existed as a thriving economic hub which served the needs of surrounding towns by the selling and exchange of homemade dishes. The mundane practice of food making allows for the contemplation of the reality in which Elandskloof finds itself, constantly negotiating its unforgivable past with a seemingly dwindling future. Food becomes essential in the understanding of how residents of Elandskloof imagine possible futures within a rapid changing environment.
This project brings together seemingly disparate threads: the long effects of colonialism, apartheid-era injustices, food heritage, and the challenges of climate change and a forgotten community.
Oh, thanks very much for that. Sorry, the videos were probably a little bit too much for the length of presentation, so I hope I won't go over too much. So that highlights one specific case study in quite a bit of detail about the importance of these more complicated narratives, the importance of voice of the community, and the importance of looking at nuance and looking at how climate affects people in different ways. But also how heritage offers capacities, whether it's through food culture, but also potentially missed opportunities in terms of the loss of culture that that might occur if we don't focus on certain injustices and certain disproportionate impacts of not just climate change, but what Karen O'Brien, a prominent IPCC researcher, terms double exposure, the impacts of social change and climate change together, interweaving into some form of perfect storm that really exposes vulnerability and undermines adaptive capacity. And this is also the case in the story in Sri Lanka around village cultures. And what Dulma, our colleague in Sri Lanka, pointed out most starkly through recent workshops coordinated with elderly members of a series of communities in eastern Sri Lanka, is that a lot of these communities are unable to pass down traditional knowledges. The younger generations have moved on elsewhere, and there isn't someone to hear their narratives and to hear of their traditional practices around water, for example. Next slide, please. And this is where we wanted to focus on heritage as a capacity, and one of the reasons to focus on heritage as capacity. Heritage is not something that's simply vulnerable and to be preserved. This is not to say that we shouldn't preserve physical sites, landscapes, and objects. It's simply that heritage means something more than that, and that the real value to sites, objects, and landscapes is actually in the people who value them and in the narratives that they can tell you about those materials. So we want to focus on how this gives meaning to people, how it gives meaning and identity to people who might be vulnerable, and how that therefore develops adaptive capacities. So heritage needs to be seen as a lens for adaptation and wider resilience. And it needs to be understood over multiple scales. We need to think about local level narratives and how sharing narratives can also empower people in face of climate risk. Next slide, please. So for that reason, we wanted to conduct risk assessments, or risk framing in this case, where we were looking at the contextual vulnerabilities and social change occurring in each location, looking at their core assets, what do the community actually value specifically, and then looking at what adaptive capacities and hazard awareness this delivers, but also how, of course, certain assets are materially or intangibly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and social change. So we wanted to look at all of these together and to start to develop narratives that take account of ongoing changes to risk and to value systems over time. Next slide, please. And I'll skip over this one. Actually, maybe I won't. Sorry, I won't. I'll skip over the next slide, but I'll look at the cross portfolio one. Yeah, thank you. And this one's about looking at it at a broader scale. This is from the first cross-portfolio workshop that we've done with the other projects across the research stream. And this was very much to look at what are the core themes that each project has identified and their achievements, what worked and what didn't, what have the challenges been around COVID-19, around trying to work with local communities. What are useful methodologies that we can share between, not just between projects, but between countries, between research streams? And then also, what are the recommendations? And you can see the recommendation section ballooning outwards. It's very much been a learning exercise for researchers about how knowledge dissemination is important. So that's what we're seeing in the first stages of the cross-portfolio work to bring together this understanding of cultural heritage and climate change more broadly. Next slide, please. So I think I've been through this. This is more of a summary from the critical project. And the summary really can be simply highlighted around the third bullet point there, that we need to give voice to local communities, and we need to give voice to experts not just from Western universities, from North America, from Western Europe and Australia, who seem to dominate the heritage literatures. We need a diversity of perspectives in order to navigate the challenge of climate risk to cultural heritage, but also climate risk more generally across society. Next slide, please. So these are the take-home messages, and this is where I'll finish. So we need to question our assumptions about how we do risk assessment. We need to question what is risk and why are we specifically focusing on a given location, a given site, a given object, particularly materials in terms of our risk assessment around cultural heritage. We need to create more platforms for knowledge exchange. We need to create platforms where people have an equal voice, and of course that was covered in at the end of the previous presentation as well, around the Climate Heritage Network. And then we also need to step back and look at multiple benefits for the project. So we need to sometimes, often these projects are run, in this case it's an AHRC DCMS project run primarily through government bodies within the UK. COVID-19 actually offered an opportunity in terms of saying, we're not just going to go to all of these countries and spend a lot of money on going to Sri Lanka, South Africa, and Indonesia. We'll leave them to it. We need to step back and let them get on with it and potentially not interfere as much. And this will hopefully develop a diversity of voices and lead to a more equal balance in terms of the direction projects take. They need to be more flexible in finding new things, learning from communities, and not just do what the project was starting with. It's not just starting with assumptions and finishing with those assumptions. It might start with assumptions and then learn something new, and that's what research projects need to do. So that's where I'll finish. Thanks very much for listening, everyone.
Thank you, Rowan Jackson, Professor Rowan Jackson, instigating very rich presentation, many points of contact with Luana also we formed, and also with the challenges presented by the project itself. So we will now move on to the last presentation for today. We expect to still have a little time for Q&A. So to close our event today is Professor Leonardo Castriota, an architect and urban planner, professor from the Federal University of Minas Gerais. At the university, he presides the Sustainable Development Institute. He is a member of the Heritage Council and has worked with a long time with heritage public policies and more recently at ICOMOS. Professor Castriota, you have the floor. I think his image has frozen. Yeah, I'm just translating first what Jurema is saying now. He's frozen, right? I was in doubt here, but everyone else is moving, so he's frozen. Can anyone from the IT stroke support do anything about it? In these cases, when there's silence, we on this side think, oh God, it's frozen, but it's definitely not frozen. You're all moving, except for Professor Leonardo. I'm being told that Leonardo's internet has crashed, and we're trying to re-establish contact, or contact re-establishment has been attempted, I should say, or is being attempted. We have so far 4 questions from our assistants, and I've broken them down more or less per approach and nature of the presentation. I think I'm going to jump ahead here. No, Leonardo has left. So I'm going to move ahead a bit here. The questions are connected to the focus of the presentations. I don't know if we'll be able to answer them all now, because if Leonardo comes back, we'll interrupt, okay? But just to put them on your radar, the 2 professors present. To Luana, I think the question from Carini from Porto Alegre city asks, how can cultural heritage become a tool? In other words, how can it mobilize these this transformation, understanding and awareness in order to fight climate change? Practical points also from the point of view of problem recognition. Leonardo is back. Yes, I'm back. Yeah, I did it. I just quickly introduced you, talked about our militants, productive militants, as a reference for us all in Brazil in the cultural heritage realm. So you have the floor now to finish off, to conclude this morning's presentation. Thank you, Jurema. I'd like to thank you all for the invitation and the invitation to be here with you. This is a very important discussion, and during this discussion, hearing the two speakers before me, I saw that in actual fact, the talks are very much connected. I'm going to actually go back to a few points that you've already touched on. It's important because it shows synergy between the connection and heritage and climate change. So please, if you could share my presentation. I'd like to start off by saying that I found it very interesting and curious to see that Don't Look Up or Do Look Up. It mentions, of course, the Hollywood film, which many of us have already watched, which showed very sarcastically, ironically, and vitriolically denialism, as we call it here, negationism, as they call it here in Brazil, denial. People were ignoring an asteroid heading for Earth, which was going to destroy it. It's curious that in this case, we have a cultural phenomenon. There is no human influence.
These things put in perspective things that we see in the movie before COVID, but the things that reflect what we're living today. I like this meme, which refers Back to the Future. If you go to the future, don't go to 2020. If you're traveling to the future, don't go to 2020, the year when we lived the pandemic, a situation we never imagined we would live, something that our generation has had never seen. We saw, or the generation of my grandfather saw that. And this situation put limits on us, limits on the planet, limits of our knowledge, the possibilities of responding to things. It is very curious because in this case, it proves how humankind has managed to scientifically give a response to such a complex event, but at the same time, managing the pandemic shows us how we are incapable, politically speaking. At the same time, when science created a vaccine in record time that allowed millions of people to survive, some governments did not align with a strategy to adopt. So these issues are related to the confronting this challenge, this situation. That was not the only crisis in 2020 and 2021. We've been living, as Luana mentioned, with a cyclical issue with climate phenomena, with extreme phenomena, as we saw the floods and the tremendous destruction of the city of Petropolis. That is not an isolated phenomenon, as Luana showed. These things repeat periodically every 5-year cycle or so. We have big slides as a result of heavy rains, the lack of interference of human interference to mitigate climate change, measures that could have been taken to avoid the tragedy. So, let's think of all these things from a certain perspective. We should think and address climate change related to the heritage issue. It is important thus that we notice that at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, three fields that had been developed in the 20th century in an isolated way, with no dialogue between them, get closer. I'm talking about heritage preservation, urban and territorial planning, and environmental preservation. These three fields apparently didn't have a conversation between them, but they get together at the end of the 20th century. And that is very important to notice, because this is due to a change in each of these elements: heritage preservation, urban and territorial planning, and environmental preservation. They should be rethought at the end of this 20th century. They change their conception, the way they articulate. Therefore, they also change the way we could think of their connection. Let's start with heritage preservation. During a long time, we were restricted to a concept of heritage, which is very limited. Heritage was identified with exceptional works of art, normally related to the elite, to the dominant groups, to the historical construction of the country, the ancient architecture and products, as a result of the work of architects, certain styles, certain times in history. Many of these things did not fit. I'm giving you a few examples of architecture. This is Cine Brasil in Belo Horizonte, which is a beautiful building which shows a style of the 1940s, and starting in the 80s we started to call it Deco. This style was considered for some time as a style that lacked peculiarities to be part of the cultural heritage. We strove to preserve this building. It is curious how things change. After 10 years, when we preserved this building, this was the main building in the whole heritage, and 10 years before it did not belong to the peculiarities of the cultural heritage of the city. So you see how things change in 10 years. So to keep in this realm of edified or built heritage, this includes, for example, commercial architecture, industrial architecture, which was not considered heritage, including that one that was considered singular architecture, peculiar as architecture, like products of architects in small villages, which became a beautiful work of art. I reported this process in the Preservation Institute. I was lucky to be a witness of that. It was a cultural heritage of the state of Rio de Janeiro already, and became cultural heritage of the country. And also cultural heritage is included here. The conception of cultural heritage used to be almost the same as works of art. That was the cultural heritage of a nation. works of art which was a product of ancient tradition. And this changes as well with the contribution of anthropology that shows us that culture is not does not equal works of art. Culture is a way of people to relate to each other. You see festivities like this one you see in the picture, the way we tell stories, the way we cook. Here you see a traditional kitchen with preparing regional food, and the way you cook this dish is now considered cultural heritage. So in the realm of heritage, we see a change of how we understand the concept. The same change applies to urban and territorial planning. It changes the concept, or the concept changes at the end of the 20th century. In the beginning of the 20th century, urban planners regretted that traditional city existed with a multiplicity of uses, and the symphony or polyphony, where usages get together and things happen at the same time. This type of concept, this type of urban conformity was seen by urban planners in the beginning of the 20th century as something that should be avoided. It should be reprojected, as Le Corbusier proposed in Paris, the Plan Voisin, where you kept monuments, but you would reproject the whole grid of the city with divisions. People would have the rights to cells and live in big towers with the right to sun and light, with all the concepts of the modern city that would replace the traditional city, which was dysfunctional. Fortunately, this was not executed, and at the end of this 20th century, we perceived that the very urban existence, the architecture, the way we articulate the streets, was a positive point and not a negative one. It was a bonus, not an onus. And many cities start to take advantage of that, and the idea of planning changes as well. We have a turning point, which was the post-World War II, when some countries started to perceive the value of the historic center, that it was not limited to their historic existence and to their arts, but for the whole population in the environments that new parts of the city didn't have. In Italy, the related institute to preserve the heritage, which includes urban planners and university professors, they concluded that the historic center should be incorporated to the planning, and their lessons should also be incorporated to new spaces with no limitation of forms, but with the lessons learned from the historic centers. So urban planning changes a lot. You see that these changes make that one field opens to the other field. Urban planning opens room to cultural heritage, and the third field is environmental preservation. I leave that very limited concept that where environment was only forests, to extend that concept to gardens. That's the botanic gardens. Apparently, we miss some of the audio of Professor Leonardo. Here is where most of the population, of human population, lives since the beginning since the end of the 20th century. And it disseminates ideas which are very important, like the human uh, heritage. So at the end of the 20th century, these fields get closer and give room to concepts which are unifying concepts, especially the idea of sustainable development, which is a concept that puts together these dimensions. That's a very interesting concept, which and also an integrating concept, and provokes um, many insights and also gives room to develop the sustainable development goals, where all stakeholders get together to reach those goals with a certain deadline, and develops the idea of continuous development and the integrated development. So it is related to the environment, but also to the economic realm and the social realm. What would that be? What would be the sustainable development in terms of environment? Is if you leave a legacy to future generations where environment is preserved. And there's this idea coming from forest engineering and extends to think of economic sustainable development and also the social one. What would that be in terms of economic of sustainable development? And what about heritage? Where does heritage fit? So when we address sustainability, we find two trends. One trend advocates for culture as a species of the fourth pillar of sustainability, together with economics, politics, ecology. And there is a trend that considers the four pillars. Next slide, please. And there's one that defends that culture is a type of cross dimension that integrates the economic pillar, the environmental pillar, and social pillar, like a layer that permeates all that. And this is the way I will act in terms of economy, environment, and social. So it is like an articulating axis of the other pillars. That's culture. So starting from these ideas of the sustainable development, international organisms, NGOs and universities address these issues that were apparently unrelated or apparently didn't relate to heritage. For example, climate change. And these urgencies are addressed in several ways. For example, we also create a list of heritage sites under threat. They are not all related to climate change, but climate change can be an important factor for us to include these sites in this list, on this list. We'll see that many of these sites are at risk, especially those where nature is almost untouched, where predominantly natural values are there. These are the most threatened. And other factors have to do with climate change, but also with activities like mining, as we've seen in a previous presentation. In developing countries, this is a very prevalent activity and a very destructive one. Recently, we've seen very serious cases, and I'll refer to them, but also to an initiative of ICOMOS, which is led by ICOMOS Germany, which is a series of publications about heritage sites under threat, where they get together and publish and request solutions to authorities and governments. And in this monitoring work, you see the causes like natural impacts, war and inter-ethnic conflicts, tourism, lack of use and maintenance, threats to urban sites, and the development pressure, which is a topic which is not so often addressed, but which is very important in terms of threats to historic heritage. For example, large-scale mining projects that threaten cultural landscapes. Here you see references to the report, like Chihuahua in Mexico, Xochicalco also in Mexico. These threats of mining are felt around the world. And I wanted to emphasize that because we live in a world, like Jurema said, where important events make a huge impact on districts. Here is Mariana. It was completely swept away, like the Rio Doce, the Doce River. It was destroyed with the destruction of the Fundão Dam. Here you see before and after with the mud spill. That is the biggest natural disaster in Brazil in terms of extension, more than 600 kilometers from Mariana City to the Atlantic Ocean, destroying landscapes, destroying nature and cities, ways of living, ways of capturing the environment, fishing activities, and so on and so forth. And this was caused by human beings. And to wrap it up, it is important to see how these changes of the concept of heritage, the idea of urban planning, the idea of environmental preservation, that in a way are shaped and that are addressed through transversal ideas like sustainable development. How this is addressed by ICOMOS, which is our International Council on Monuments and Sites. Since 2017, I'm the vice president for the Americas. ICOMOS, as you know, was created in the 1960s in the context of UNESCO to address the challenges that were first reported in the Venice chart, where the need for experts were detected to help UNESCO in issues of cultural heritage. And the document of 1972 is the result of that. Since then, ICOMOS is an international organization present in 144 countries with experts from different areas in regional committees in more than 100 countries, where 29 countries are systematic, or 29 topics are addressed, with recent committees like water, natural landscape, heritage and religion. These are thematic groups. It is very important to see how we extend that. We have work groups that address emerging topics like the Millennium Goals and climate change. It is an attempt of that organization, which is created with a traditional concept of heritage, but is challenged to address these challenges and articulate with other areas, with urban um, planning, territorial planning, and environmental preservation. In this search, we had the first meeting with UNESCO and IPCC and ICOMOS. The idea of this meeting in December last year was to bring these organizations, the Committee Monitoring Climate Change, with two organizations that address symbolic dimensions and material dimensions, cultural dimensions. The idea is to strengthen the synergy between climate and culture in order to change the approach of science. It should incorporate this perspective that comes from our area, that it belongs to humanities, although it's a technical area. So we put together scientists and experts to study and explore these links, as was shown in the previous presentations, between culture and heritage, climate science and climate action. It seems that our perspective of heritage can contribute to mitigate climate change, can significantly contribute to that. And this was something that was perceived by UNESCO and ICOMOS, but also by IPCC. Dr. Deborah Roberts by IPCC says that ambitious climate action is dependent on a whole of society response. This meeting will explore, she said in December, the critical cultural, natural, heritage, climate change nexus, and marks an important opportunity to mobilize knowledge. This knowledge could help us create an equitable, low carbon and climate resilient future. That means it is very important that we have this conversation and that we perceive the action of culture on the pillar of environment and social and economy. Culture is a type of lens. This expression has been used by in the previous presentation, as when he mentions storytelling. This is one of the mechanisms that are used for us to understand the environment. We see environment through this lens. We can only understand our action, our economic action, if we notice that it is also informed by a worldview, by values, by social organization. Next slide for us to wrap it up. And to close this presentation, I wanted to bring some small perspective that we started 10 years ago, which had to do with urban, with agriculture and the preparation of land, which is a concept that is developed from studies of Ramakrishna in the University of New Delhi in India. They use a very interesting concept: agricultural heritage systems, which are globally important indigenous agricultural heritage systems. It's an idea that there is an ingenious knowledge of nature, of climate cycles and wind and water that allows us to manage the environment in a wise way. And that these GIAs are complex agricultural systems that are kept by traditional societies and are managed casually or with low intensity as components of the natural and cultural landscape, preserved by the values of society, closely linked with the cultural culture of that landscape. These complex global systems are a result in traditional societies. Speaker's audio is freezing. The interpreter apologizes for that. When we put together tangible and intangible nature and culture, these are lessons we can learn and that are valued by heritage. In this holistic perspective, I would like to wrap up my presentation saying that our collaboration in this meeting is crucial for us to confront climate change and the extreme effects that we see. It is very important to look up, but as our speakers remember, it is important to look back and to look ahead. Thank you very much. Thank you, Leonardo. Thank you all. We're running short of time. We have 15 minutes tolerance. It's 12 p.m. now. We have 15 minutes extra that we'll use for questions from the audience. Of course, we would have a very rich territory to elaborate the interface between the talks which complement each other in terms of heritage, climate change, the knowledge, values, and local perspectives to understand that environment and heritage. The idea to have this systemic perspective, as Luana mentioned, is also has to do with the preservation of all of that. But let's address the 4 questions we selected here. I had summarized the 4 questions and directed to what I thought that related more to the talks. So I'll ask the 4 questions directly to the respondents, and we'll move straight to the answers. So I had asked Luana the question when we had that brief interruption when Leonardo froze. Camila from Porto Alegre asks, how can heritage be a tool to mobilize this understanding, this looking up, or these looking to the sides in terms of climate change? And the other 2 questions complement each other. Samantha from Brumadinho asks, how can we face the lack of priority and lack of acknowledgement by governments of heritage as a priority in public policies? And Rafael from Itabira asks if the law, or rather, how can we get support from the law to address climate change? So priority, not lack of priority in climate change in public policies. I would like to ask Leonardo, and I rely on his expertise in managing heritage. And for Rowan, I'd like to ask Micaela's question. She's from Nova Lima. She's concerned about tourism, predatory tourism versus sustainable tourism. How can we invert this logic, especially in Brazil? If you could talk about your experience in the United Kingdom with the Association of Heritage and Tourism, maybe you could give us insights about that. So an inverted or a reversed approach from predatory tourism to sustainable tourism. So I'll start with Luana, talking about heritage as a tool for understanding this transformation and risk reduction resulting from climate changes.
Thank you, Jurema. Karina, thank you for your question. There are many ways we can think about heritage as a tool, as an instrument, both to draw attention to climate changes, the risks related to climate change, and a mitigating element. Let's think about the mitigating element side. I here have some elements related to riverside communities, indigenous people who already develop sustainability projects which can serve as mitigating elements. In terms of risk management, it's possible to think of heritage as a space to monitor certain climate events, as is the case in some schools through the initiative developed by Sumading. If you look at heritage, those who look will be provoked to show some emotions, from immediate recognition to memory, the historical memory, remember, representativeness or not for and regarding that heritage. Reflect, think, seek asset under this lens. If this is done, this will help us to associate the image of a past where environmental conditions were, let's say, X. And within a change context, this change of heritage will be an instrument of resilience for those who visit, study, or work with it. So there is an enormous gamut of possibilities where cultural heritage, be it material or immaterial, can be used as a tool for mitigation, risk management, resilience, and all these possibilities need to be stewarded. They need to be used. They need to be dealt with or treated as elements within public policies, management policies. Thus, we will be able to move forward in that respect. I wanted to be succinct. So, second question is for Rowan. I wonder if you could talk to us about this tourism and predatory tourism relationship. Who knows the UK? You have a key to the problem.
Oh yeah, I think it's a very good question, and it's a challenging question for sure. I suppose I think the answer to the question, the best answer to the question that I could give at least, is actually rooted in what we've seen from the last presentation, which is about balancing those spheres or pillars, depending on how you'd like to conceive of them, of sustainable development. And I think the heritage sector as a whole has a really important role to play when it comes to stakeholder engagement to balance those spheres. So often, if you read documents online about tourism, you do start to stray into that predatory category, as you've defined it in the question. And that's usually because there's disproportionate attention to the economic assets. Heritage is an economic asset, and it often comes at the expense of those social and environmental dimensions of sustainable development that we want to balance. And I think by positioning cultural heritage, and particularly culture, the culture of local communities, the culture of the region or the nation, or internationally, how we recognise the culture in that region. If we use that to balance those spheres, it becomes something the heritage sector has a really important position in. So from my experience in Edinburgh with the World Heritage Site, the recent World Heritage site that's been reviewed here, which is the Old and New Town. So if you ever visit Edinburgh, it's divided into two towns. This is the Old Town with the castle at the north end of it, and then the New Town beyond that. The assessment there has been, World Heritage have done a big stakeholder exercise to try and look not just at the economic assets for tourists in terms of the castle and how much revenue it brings in, and all of the outlets in the Old Town and along the Royal Mile, but to also look at the importance to local community members, local businesses, local organisations, at the grassroots level, and to also look at their concerns around things like environmental dimensions, around how green Edinburgh is. It's quite a green city in terms of cities we see around the United Kingdom, but also concerns around climate change, the impact of climate change on the castle. And we really need to balance all of these together, and it's a huge multi-stakeholder exercise and multi-organisational challenge. Historic Environment Scotland, we've got a lot of the organisations who own property within the old and new town, and large estates from the University of Edinburgh that run across the old and new town as well. So that's one example of where we need to balance those to create a sustainable model for our cities as a whole. So Edinburgh, I would say, isn't very sustainable at present in terms of its very strong emphasis on the gateway being the airport, which is of course also contributing towards the climate emergency, and also around just funneling as many people into the city as possible, without due regard perhaps of the local communities and their concerns around things like litter or impact on different parts of the city, and of things like the sort of Harry Potterization of Edinburgh. That everything is dominated by what tourists want as opposed to what's actually authentic, and that once again goes back to the authorization of cultural heritage discourse, the tourist gaze, that sort of concept that around selling an image or giving off a specific image that might speak to specific interests but not actually speak to the reality of how communities and society appreciates the cultural relevance of a given location. So we've spoken a lot about Edinburgh there, but there are similar challenges. The reason I focused on that in Yogyakarta, and similar concerns around how local communities might in fact be displaced as a result of these predatory effects of a World Heritage city or World Heritage sites within the area that start to push local communities out, start to gentrify certain locations, and in fact start to have that negative impact on community identity and local cultural heritage. So they all have to be balanced very carefully, and I think once again, going back to the spheres, one way to visualize it is to go back to the spheres of sustainable development and to think carefully about balancing each of those around cultural heritage as a whole. So thanks very much for the question.
Thank you, Rowan. So, Leo, for you now, the question is the little priority given to heritage by public policies, and how legislation, if it is indeed updated, does it have enough tools in order to face climate change issues? I'm talking about Brazil, right? The Brazil case. I think I can say that we have reasonable legislation. It's not really about the legislation itself. I think there are a few factors that have hindered. I could mention many, but I'm going to talk about one internal one, which is the posture of heritage, which hinders his connection is breaking up. There is a strong connection between incorporating an increased concept of heritage and its effectiveness by the heritage entities. There is a difficulty they have with this. Sometimes incorporation is just rhetorical. When Rowan, when he talked about Edinburgh, I think it's very important when he talked about involvement of the stakeholders, the agents, not just looking to the future to go back to the old concept of heritage concepts, but the agents that will afford value. So we need to work on these value matrices and understand how different agents relate to the heritage so that the idea of heritage happens within this dynamic value matrix. So it's an agent there. If you don't understand, you continue with your discourse, especially with your practice and discourse, which are dogmatic. Our protection dossiers did not take the most simple aspect. In spite of the increased discourse, people still think of conservation based on materiality. This brings up enormous mistakes. It it avoids that heritage entities can focus on what really matters and can present themselves as agents in these disputes. As a powerful agent, we work with knowledge that is very powerful because it relates to our cultural base. It is very strongly connected to the way we socially structure ourselves and relate and can relate strongly to how we can, for example, work on the economy. So heritage can be a very strong force. But for that, the heritage entities could. I'm talking about Brazil, and his image is frozen again. Yes, I see now. Once again, it's frozen for everyone. In these advances, I'm just picking up pieces now. I'm afraid. But from a methodological, practical point of view, sorry, my internet today is quite crappy, especially here during our meeting. The need to incorporate conservation methodology based on values. No, but we were able to convey your message. So we have reached the end of our event. I believe that all these episodes are recorded via at least YouTube. We have great contribution from our three speakers today. So we added up all the questions from those accompanying this event. I have no information about the next date. If anybody can help me here about the next date of our event, Gustavo, maybe. So we'll call it a day now. Thanks very much. All the best. See you next time. Bye. Bye.